Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to IABC's Circle of Fellows. I'm Shel Holtz. I am Senior Director of Communications at Webcor, a commercial builder in California, headquartered in San Francisco. I am coming to you from the San Francisco East Bay, Concord, California, and I will be moderating today's panel of fellows for a discussion on crisis management and crisis communication, and have a great panel to have this conversation with. I do want to let everyone know before we do introductions that you can be a part of this discussion just by entering your comment, observation, experience, whatever, into the comment field on that YouTube Live. And there's George. Hopefully, George, can we hear you? No, yeah. We can't hear him. This is an audio problem that we were dealing with before we went live. So we'll hope that George can work on that. And in the meantime, as I said, please participate in the conversation, and I can share those comments and the like on the screen. And we will address those. But until we see any of those, we'll have a conversation based on the questions that I have. And I would like to introduce the panel now. Actually, what I'll do is a quick introduction and then have them introduce themselves, starting with Robin.
Okay, thank you. I'm Robin McCasland, a Senior Director of Communications for Healthcare Service Corporation. We are a major healthcare insurer in the United States, and my function is leading all of the employee or internal communication for the business. I have a team of about 16 people scattered everywhere, including our home base, which is Chicago, but I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and I'm glad to be here today.
Glad you're here too, Robin. Carolyn.
Good morning to everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Caroline Sapriel. I'm the founder and managing partner of CSNA International. We've been around for 35 years, specializing in risk, crisis, and business continuity management. We service multinational clients around the world, literally, with a team that is also scattered, with a core team based in Europe. I myself, most of the time in Brussels or near Brussels.
Well, thanks for joining us, Caroline. Ned, you're up. And it looks like Ned is frozen again. And we're having some interesting... Oh, Ned, are you with us? I just saw movement.
I'm here.
Great. Can you introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Ned, Can you introduce yourself?
Gladly. I'm Ned Lundquist. I'm here in Spring. I'm working on it, Shel. I'm Ned Lundquist. I'm in Springfield, Virginia. Can you hear me at all?
Yes. I think we have some lag here.
Maybe there's a delay or something. I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize. So Ned Lundquist. I'm in Springfield, Virginia. I have my own company, Echo Bridge LLC. My wife likes to remind me that I'm retired. So, but I'm really glad to be with my fellows. It's always a fascinating conversation, and I hope everybody sitting around and listening to it will find it fascinating as well.
I hope so too. And George McGrath, when he comes back, hopefully able to resolve that audio problem, and we'll have him introduce himself when he joins us. But we are talking crisis today, and I find this to be a very relevant conversation, mainly because I am developing the crisis management scaffolding for the company I work at right now. This came about with the realization that what we had was an emergency management plan, but really do need the crisis management framework as well. So I've been doing a lot of reading and research on this, so I'm primed. I'm pumped for this conversation today. So let's start with a reality check. How many of you have worked with leadership teams that genuinely believed they were crisis ready and turned out not to be? And this is a two-part question. And what was the most common gap that you saw between what leaders thought they had and what they actually had? And whoever wants to go can go.
I'm okay to go.
Do it.
Well, yes, I have, and I work with senior leaders at that level all the time. And many of them think they're ready because they believe that their years of experience and seniority in their companies or what in their career makes them by default crisis savvy. But you don't manage a crisis like you manage a bad week at the office. And what I find is possibly the most challenging part, especially if you look at the world today and the geopolitical issues and everything that is happening. I find that the biggest challenge is to fight what is called the optimism bias. So most people are okay to think, well, okay, I can manage the crisis, but in fact, crises typically gets worse before they get better. And therefore, the job of senior leadership is to really anticipate how much worse is this going to get and what do I put in place to be ready for the next wave. That's a real difficult thing for senior leaders. It's difficult for most human beings because we survive by hoping for the best and not planning for the worst. But in fact, at that level and crisis teams is exactly what they need to do, is change that mindset and continuously think of the worst and plan for worst case scenarios.
I'll add to that. I agree with you wholeheartedly, Caroline, and I'd add to that, in the last 21-ish years, the advent of social media and how that has changed how we all need to respond, including leadership. And I think sometimes until someone at a very senior level is faced with a serious crisis, they don't feel that impact because there's so much misinformation. There are people who can put something out there, it goes viral immediately, whether or not it's accurate. And then, what you thought was your priority that day on that particular crisis has now changed within a matter of minutes or hours or whatever that might be. And so it requires a much more agile response and being prepared for, several directions that this thing could go instead of one or two. And I think a lot of communication professionals understand that. It's preparing your leadership and other people who are involved in those crises, making them aware that we're dealing with something very different now, and you have to prepare differently for that.
Yeah, I'll add that, like Carolyn said, you really have to anticipate the worst case scenario, and that you hope isn't going to happen, but your preparations have to be able to escalate from a pretty bad situation to a crisis, to a major crisis, to a global crisis. And sometimes it's hard to imagine that. Sometimes it's hard to think that that could happen to us, to our organization. But if you do, it's definitely reached its worst case, or a very bad case scenario. So I think that trying to walk your team, at least, if leadership isn't willing to listen to that, to do excursions down the path of what happens if this blows up, what happens if this person gets assassinated or killed in the office, what happens if we have an active shooter that comes in and starts killing our people and holding hostages, and now we have the media at our doorstep and a gun at our head at the same time. So these are situations that happen. They don't happen often, thank you, but they do happen. So I think anticipating the worst. And Shell, I'd like to kind of know the difference, how you look at the difference between an emergency plan and a crisis plan.
Well, yeah, I can definitely talk about that from my perspective. As I mentioned, I work for a general contractor and a builder. We have projects where you can anticipate things that are going to happen that are emergencies. There's going to be a safety incident. There's going to be a utility strike. Something's going to fall and maybe hit somebody on the street, hit a car. It's anything where you have to call 911 from a project. George, hi.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Can you see me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can hear you and we
Good.
can see you.
Hi.
Welcome. Very quickly, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm George McGrath, and I've experienced a crisis with my microphone. I'm delighted to be here and join you for this conversation. I've done a lot of work over the years with crisis preparedness with clients and also issues management. I think both disciplines are related, so look forward to the conversation today.
Definitely. And I can tell you where we're at, George, is the distinction between an emergency and a crisis. These are anticipated at where I work. They are easily anticipated things. I mean, they don't happen on every project. They don't happen all the time, but it's easy to anticipate that these are coming. And by and large, they are not existential. They're not going to cause the company to go out of business. The media is not going to show up for these things. But there are protocols in place. You know, if there's a regulatory agency you have to call, for example, this is the kind of an emergency where you can pull down the binder and say, okay, it's this category. These are the steps. And I'd be interested in all of your perspectives. But from where I sit, a crisis these days is not. It's not easy to have a binder that lets you follow the steps anymore. I think this was true maybe 20, 25 years ago and earlier, but things have changed, and the whole idea of addressing a crisis has moved beyond this idea of we've had a crisis, let's open up the binder and start checking off boxes.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to add another point on the difference between emergency and crisis. Is the main difference is that in a crisis you have no control. You can only control the way you choose to deal with the situation. An emergency is often physical, security, safety, and therefore you can follow, in fact you have to follow by law a number of protocols, be them security or safety. There's not a single framework in the world that regulates crisis management. There's a standard, there's an ISO standard, but you're not going to get shut down and your team is not going to get fired because you didn't handle the crisis well. And because you have emergency plans in place and incident command and all that stuff that is applicable to a lot of the sort of physical and sort of industrial type of organizations, doesn't mean by that your team is going to be able to manage a crisis where by definition you have no control. I think that's a big difference.
And you mentioned the kind of the hierarchical organization that has an incident center that you can set up. For example, let's say you have an oil spill in Puget Sound. You're going to have state, federal, local entities that will start putting their representatives into the Joint Harbor Communication Center, Emergency Center, and those that need to be there, the municipalities, the agencies, they already know what desk they're going to sit at. They've been through exercises and training there before, and it quickly coalesces and it gives you a way to deal with the emergency in the hopes that it doesn't rise to the crisis level.
Exactly. It's supposed to mitigate. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on the distinction between emergencies and crises? And is there a way to make sure that in the organization, the people who are calling the shots, the leadership, understands where that line is drawn?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think you said that we should no longer have a playbook. I kind of disagree with that, because you ask many people in organizations and they can't make the difference between an incident, an emergency, and crisis. And I think you have to have some fundamental understanding. And of course, the book is not going to tell you how to manage a crisis. You have to have training and you have to have experience. But without the book in place, you're going to improvise and everybody's going to have a different understanding. So a common protocol, I think, is very useful. Also because you get a lot of turnover and not everybody on the teams that are supposed to be in charge has had a lot of experience. So unless you give them something that is approved by the organization and is best practice, yeah, then you start with nothing and you just follow kind of the wind. So that's
the
And
final.
that's where communicators have to have a good working relationship with their bosses so that the bosses will listen to them, and you're going to have a free flow of accurate information as opposed to speculation or innuendo.
Mhm.
And I would add to that as well that you've got a lot of different audiences, obviously, not just the media, not just the general public, your employees, which is where my heart is at. And sometimes that requires that you are, which you would do anyway, meeting daily. And while you have a consistent message about the latest that is going on with this crisis, you have to think about those audiences and say, what is this audience going to care about? Because what the employees care about, they can hear what's in the media, they can hear those things, but it's like, what do they care about? Because they may be thinking something very different. It becomes more personal for them because they're employed by your organization. And so you think about, like, how are you going to translate this same message for them in a way that feeds them and gives them what they need? And then figuring out, like, how often do you need to do that? Is it a daily update? Is it whatever that is? It may not follow the script or the process or the flow chart, if you will, that you are accustomed to doing, because these things can evolve very quickly. But I think that's really important because long term, crisis is over, whatever, you don't know how that has impacted your best asset and how they feel about things differently depending on the nature of the crisis. So I think keeping those in mind, it's not just the external audiences and the public, it's definitely your employees as well, and how you share those messages with them in a way that resonates with them.
And Caroline, when I was talking about the binder, I don't mean that we don't have a plan. I just mean that they're not linear anymore. You just can't tick each box in order the way we could maybe 30 years ago and had a little more control over the responses. Things are happening that you can't anticipate, and you need to be nimble enough to be able to pivot, even possibly start to change the underlying messages in response to what's happening out there.
Right. I would make the case that I understand. I totally agree. I think it is far less linear. It's very, very complex, but it brings to mind, for instance, at the moment, we get a major supply crisis because of geopolitical situations. And that is not an accident, an active shooter. That is something that is happening outside of your control. And if you ask most organizations, what do you do if you have a supply problem? They turn it over to business continuity planning, which is regulated, which is audited, which is part of compliance. And so people feel safe. He said, oh, you got a business continuity plan. Well, that's fine and well, because your business continuity plan is going to tell you if this supply mechanism or channel doesn't work, this is your backup. It doesn't tell leadership or management teams or crisis team how to actually handle the disruption of the supply crisis. So I think there's a confusion, and I think there lies fundamentally the problem in getting sufficient attention. It still seems to me that for a lot of organizations, crisis management is a nice to have. It's not a must have. Whereas risk is audited, business continuity is audited, it is regulated. So I think we're lagging behind, and I think until that changes, it's going to be hard to kind of shift the attention to it in a proactive way as opposed to reactive, which is still very much the case in a lot of places.
I look at the Deepwater Horizon incident in the Gulf several years back, which was a very bad situation for BP and the companies involved with that oil well. And it was truly a global level emergency. But when the CEO of British Petroleum said, I got to go home to my family, I got a life, that's when it really blew up, and the company, their entire reputation was on the line at that point. So how you handle something, even innocuously, you think can change the course of everything.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to Shell's question to begin with. What is the gap? I think the gap is very much at the senior level. When there's a crisis, unfortunately, more often than not, ego gets in the way, because I can tell you from experience that BP had absolutely impeccable crisis protocols and teams around the world to handle it. But when it comes down to one person who decides that they're going to do it their own way, and that's what we see very often. So it is a major gap. It doesn't mean every leader is going to have his ego in the way, but unfortunately it does happen actually fairly regularly. And these leaders are not always aware of what, Robin was talking about, that the media is everywhere now. It's everywhere. So you can't just assume that you can behave and say whatever you want and it's not going to get picked up. Those days are over. In that sense, it's very different now.
George, were you going to?
Yeah, I think the key thing in crisis management is to be able to convene the right people, decision makers inside, to deal with the situation, because the playbook can only take you so far. They're going to have to make judgments about business judgments, but they also have to make ethical judgments in a lot of these situations. So the ability to connect and convene the right people to make those decisions is key, and backed up by the books and the procedures. So much today is coming just from totally new sources of information. Years ago we had a news cycle you could manage your way through. You said, well, I got 2 to 24 hours to kind of get this thing right. Now it's almost instantaneous. You don't know where the critics are going to come from. You don't know where the problems are going to come from. And that makes it particularly challenging for communicators in these situations. The playbook can help. It's good, particularly I think for these operational issues where there's a lot of this stuff is known steps you're going through. But it's tough on these reputational issues that almost can involve your industry or just suck your company into it.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the first crisis to emerge on a Substack. It's sort of completely out of sight, right? Robin, you emphasize the importance of reinforcing normalcy and organizational foundations during turbulent times. What does that look like in practice, and how do you help communicators make the case for doing that work before a crisis happens?
Yeah, no, that's I firmly believe in that. There's a couple things. So business is going along, you have a cycle of how you communicate with your folks internally, and that's what they're accustomed to, if that's working well for your organization. So to the extent that you keep what feels normal and regular to them, the routine, if you will, is very helpful. I think of examples too, like while not everybody was impacted, well, we're all impacted in our own way when COVID happened. And we sent everybody, home to work from home for an extended time period. We started having a daily message from our chairman of the board, and then he was about to become CEO. And that became a regular thing until we knew a little bit more about what this COVID thing looked like and what it meant to us. And we work in healthcare, so we had a special interest in what was happening with that. And I think that, so doing the regular cycles, not business as usual, but things that they are familiar with, but also making sure they were hearing from leadership every single weekday, a simple message. This is something that we're approaching here. This is a population of people. This is how we're serving our healthcare members in this situation. And that includes our employees, because we're healthcare members too. That routine familiarity is something that people cling to. It's like you have habits in your life that you're comfortable with, or if you're a person of faith, you go to church or synagogue on a regular basis, whatever that might be. Those things that you can keep same to the best of your ability gives people a sense of comfort. And also the communication, even if the daily communication is not that much has changed, but you're telling a personal story, something that gives people sort of the heart and soul of your leadership, that does a lot to help people feel like we have the right people in charge. I am confident. I support them. I feel like they're doing everything they can to address this, whatever the circumstance may be. I think the routine and the sameness, to the extent that you can, is very important.
I think building goodwill before you enter a crisis is, key, and sort of getting that cushion that will help you manage your way through. I think it was Mark Twain who said, when you need a friend, it's too late to make one. And that's a situation, we face. If we're not building those relationships with those constituents internally and externally before you run into a problem. And I think certain industries have got some particular vulnerabilities in that way as well. So that's a challenge, I think, for us as communicators, to be building those relationships with those audiences over time, doing the right thing, so that when you get into a jam, people are going to give you at least some benefit of the doubt to work your way through. And that's what I think is missing. A lot of people get hammered in these crisis situations.
Cal, you mentioned a crisis emerging on Substack. I personally have not had to manage a large organizational crisis in the age of influencers. So I admit that I'm not an expert in that. We used to know who the media were, who the legitimate media were, who were the kind of the shadow media, and who were people we really needed to talk to. And of course, being open and honest with everybody, you hope that they take your message and pass it through to their audience. But there are so many people now that can have an audience and can interject something about your crisis, whether they talk to you about it or not. How do you monitor all that and track it so that you can be able to respond to it or rebuke it or somehow notify your leadership how a situation is being played out?
Yeah, it's really interesting because Substack is one of those channels where anybody can start one, but it has become a favorite of journalists who have lost the job that they had in a newsroom. And entrepreneurialism has become important in the world of journalism as people lose their mainstream media jobs and want to continue to be journalists. And getting people to pay for your Substack, if you're a credible voice out there with something interesting to say, is one way to do that. So you have anybody who has no credibility with a Substack and somebody who was a mainstream journalist for 20 years. Just continuing to ply their trade there. How do you learn who to pay attention to? And how do you monitor what they're saying that could affect you? So yeah, this is one of the things that we're dealing with now. George, you noted that some industries, like high tech, seem to navigate crises, even polycrises, better than others. And we have not used the word polycrisis yet. This is where you are faced with more than one at the same time. And very often the first crisis you were facing created the second and the third, but they are different in nature. One may be reputational, one may be financial, for example. What specifically can communicators and teams in slower moving industries borrow from how tech handles these crises, George?
Well, I think one is the idea of constantly scanning for around issues that are developing that could affect your business for better or worse. And any company can do that. In fact, I think it's key for companies in slower moving industries because a crisis can do more damage just because you're not always in that scrum every day like the tech companies are. So how you handle the crisis, how you respond, you're going to be held to a very high standard. So I think the key is to be monitoring, scanning online for issues that affect your industry and your company. For example, a consumer products company, let's say in the food business, there's issues right now about food additives, purity of food supply, healthy foods, clean foods. So if you're in that business, that's something you want to look at, because if you have a problem in your plant, let's say your plant has a contamination problem, those other issues will get sucked into it as well and could elevate the crisis even more and affect your sales. So I think always monitoring the trends that are out there in the news cycle, in the news, whether it's a real mainstream news publication or, as you say, these Substack is key.
Carolyn, your work frames scenario planning differently depending on the phase, pre-crisis, latent, acute. Can you walk us through what good scenario planning actually looks like at each stage and where most organizations fall short with these?
Yeah, it's very relevant at the moment because indeed we're getting a lot of inquiries on this because everything that's going on and obviously companies and individuals feeling they have, less control and it's so unpredictable and volatile. So yes, it's always been relevant. It's a strategic tool. In fact, we've developed a crisis leadership competency protocol, and scenario planning is one of the competencies that we list as required for crisis leaders or senior leaders. So indeed, there's two main phases. So there is sort of the pre-crisis, and that falls into the risk and issues management. I got to tell you though, in my career, I think it's a major gap that communicators have. So many times I've gone into organizations and realized that the communicators have never seen the risk register of their company. They don't know what it means because it tends to be an abstract concept, enterprise risk management. It's handled by very specific people, corporate planning or finance, and it's not put in a way that communicators are not necessarily trained or exposed to this. It is a combination of the fact that this type of risk management is way too abstract, but there tends to be also the perception that the communicator is the antenna to the outside world, and therefore they're very good at issues management. So how is an issue becoming a risk? And what is a risk? So I think the scenario planning in terms of we operate in this environment, this is what we manufacture. So like, Ned was saying, there's a number of things you can anticipate that can go wrong within the realm of your organization, its activities, but also in the environment where you are operating. So if you operate in Southeast Asia, the chance you're going to have a typhoon, as an example, is pretty high. That's an outside event. If you operate in other parts, active shooters it's an outside event. But within the scope and the sphere of your own activities, what are the vulnerabilities? What are the things that can go wrong? So that's one part of scenario planning. And in fact, the idea is that you identify them, you rank them. So you look at critical risk being the high likelihood and high impact, and you actually map out the scenario and you put in place strategies that correspond a mitigation strategy that correspond to maybe 1, 2, or 3 iteration of that scenario. That's one part. That's generally done okay by a lot of organizations. The largest ones will have planning. They do have risk management committees and everything else. Where it becomes a bigger challenge is what I was saying earlier, is if you're in the middle of a crisis, the human psyche really struggles to anticipate that this is going to get worse. And COVID is the best example. The first wave of COVID, most companies said, this is going to be over in a few months. And it lasted 2 years and it got much worse than it was at the beginning. So there's something in the human psyche that makes it's very, very hard when things are bad to think that they're actually going to get worse. And it's a dichotomy in the organization because on the one hand, leaders want to inspire and give their employees and staff hope. So this is hope for the best, but their job at that level is to continuously think of the worst and put out mitigation steps in place that whilst it's bad, it's probably going to get worse. So what else are we going to do? And, recently somebody asked me for a template for this. It's not just thing as a template. Yeah, I mean, there's ways to map this. We happen to have a software, but that's irrelevant. It is a continuous effort that should be articulated with corresponding steps and strategies so that when you do get the second knock on the head, you're actually prepared as opposed to react and react and react. So it offers resilience for the organization to navigate this, but also personally and for the teams, if you're looking for ways that things are going to get worse and prepare for them, you actually move from a reactivity to a proactivity, and you empower teams to actually take action in a way that is possibly going to prevent or make it better, more resilient for the escalation. So yes, there's two stages. I find the pre-crisis stage generally more accepted. The in-crisis stage of scenario planning is much harder for most organizations, and there's nothing in place for that in many places.
And Caroline, to add to what you were saying, I think when you are prepared the way that you are discussing, then it's what you were saying, people reacting to things versus responding to things. And we're human, and so your various audiences see, you may be saying the right things, but they see your facial expressions, they see your mannerisms, they see whether you're calm, whether you're going through the facts and the latest calmly. And when you haven't had the kind of preparation that you're discussing, it's going to show somewhere with your senior leader, because right? You want them to come across as, we've got a handle on this. Some new things have happened. This is how we're addressing them. You want that versus the other scenario, which is, you can see the sweat and you can see it in their eyes and things like that, that they're nervous about being in front of the, the organization or the cameras telling you what's going on. And that's not what you want to, we all pick up on those cues. That is not what you want to transmit in a crisis.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is that there's the skills that you can acquire, but also the actual fact that you've developed worst case scenarios makes you confident to speak about them. So there's the skill, but there's also the content.
Well, and to that point, there's
also the issue of having your reputation intact. Go ahead.
Robin?
While Ned is getting back, you can do media planning and crisis training and stuff, but doing it more often, or when you're in these situations, having a daily, this is what's going on. So it's almost like that periodic rehearsal. So it's not like, we had media training 11 months ago and now I have to deal with this, or I have to respond to this, right? It's ongoing for sure. Yeah, that's the
totally.
best.
Totally. The skills have to be fresh. But what I'm saying is the skills alone are not going to carry it. So you need to have both. You need to do the work of the worst case scenario, articulate them, and put in place strategies and then have the skills to communicate them. So I think it's a combination of both to be taken seriously.
And that's why I wanted to say that, it's really important to go into a crisis, whether you could anticipate it or not, with your reputation intact from the outset. If you don't have the trust of your own people, of the media, of the community, whoever your audiences are, you can't surge trust overnight. It's really important to build your brand, which is everything that other people think about you, and build your reputation. So when you take a little hit, you can absorb it, because people by and large trust you and respect you.
Yeah, I don't remember who said this in the our planning document, but hope is not a plan. Optimism bias is a real liability.
Absolutely.
So how do you counter optimism bias in a room full of leaders who really want to believe that everything's going to work out just fine?
Well, training doesn't work, because at that level, leaders reject training. So we take the route of excellence in crisis leadership workshops, coaching, and really throwing at them the types of situations where just the huge, like you said earlier, just going back the book isn't going to make it, because there's so much uncertainty. It's accepting that there is no control is also part of it. Leaders like control, and when there's no control, they really struggle. So how to navigate a situation without control is what I was talking about. It's crisis leadership competencies. And if it's not because you've been a leader in your field, in your organization, or a captain of industry for many years, that you are by default a crisis leader. No, it doesn't happen that way.
Oh, let's talk about what happens when a crisis erupts, because I've heard from more than one communicator who has been actively involved in developing their crisis framework, their crisis strategy. They manage the crisis drills. Then a crisis erupts and they're immediately sidelined by legal and operations. So how do you position the communication function as more than just decorative in those first hours that are so critical during a crisis?
Well, that's part of your, I don't want to use the word playbook again, but it's part of your playbook overall, right? And it's the work you're doing to position yourselves as those trusted advisors when there's not a crisis, so that the leaders that your team works with already know that they can rely on you and trust your advice, or at least take that under advisement. If you're waiting until a crisis and hope they're going to do that, then you may have a problem, right? So it's the work you do when everything is okay to make sure that they come to rely on you in the first place, so that that path is a little easier. Yes, legal is going to do what they do, but at least you have now the right audience, whether it's legal or the other folks who are involved in the crisis, to say we have to pay attention to communication and how this may play out with our own teams internally, and then what that's going to play out like in the media or with other external audiences. And if you haven't done that work up front, which is business comms 101, then it's not going to suddenly fly when you have a crisis.
Yeah, and I think it's
Well-
also goes back to the point that I was making, that I think in general communicators need to have a bigger and deeper interest in the business that they work for and the risk management aspect. So it's one of those things, you know, very often crisis teams or senior leaders are going to say, oh, let's take that hot potato and throw it in the lap of the communicator so they can go with it. In fact, it's a two-way street. You do need the positioning created by the leadership. What is going to be our position here? What are we going to, where are values? Once that is stated by the crisis team, the comms person or the comms department or comms team needs to articulate that into palatable messages and everything else. Legal absolutely has a role. Nothing should go out in a crisis without being vetted by legal, but it should be a balancing act. And it's not one over the other. But you need to have crisis team really aware that all these roles are just as important. So building it up front, like Robin says, is absolutely important, but also getting communicators to understand a little bit more and wider about risk management and business continuity.
Right. You don't get that buy-in if you are not doing what you said, which is learning the business, understanding those things that you talked about earlier in our discussion. That doesn't happen. So you have an obligation as a communication professional, if you want to be good at it, to really learn your business and understand those things that some communicators go, I just do comms. And it's like, well, if you say I just do comms, you're always going to be that person over on the side versus somebody who is taken seriously in these kinds of situations.
Totally. I mean, I couldn't agree more.
Ned, I think you were going to jump in.
Well, I wanted to kind of interject something that should be important for business communicators. We who were accredited business communicators had to take a pretty serious examination after our portfolios were judged worthy. And the examination also included an oral examination with other accredited business communicators evaluating you, and which dealt with the crisis. And as someone who sat in on a lot of those evaluations, you could tell if someone had the right feel for how to respond to a crisis, to be prepared for it, to notify leadership of what they need to know, to be standing behind leadership when they need to be getting the messaging out to the right audiences. And that the accredited business communicator designation is now the SCMP. Robin has that. Maybe Robin, can you tell us, does the SCMP designation deal with crisis communication? And then maybe also you could add how someone wanting to learn about crisis communication could attend an IABC chapter meeting or a regional conference or the international world conference coming up in June that could help give them some information and connections with people that could help them out.
For sure. And I would add to the list of great things you just said, Ned, I would add to connect with somebody in your organization who specializes in that. Like I was in media relations earlier in my career, and then later in my career, I focused on more on the internal side. But I think if you have a mentor relationship or an opportunity to shadow people and learn from them directly in your own organization or another one, maybe a connection you've made through IABC or another organization, that personal connection is going to be really helpful if you don't work in that space currently. On the certification exams, there's the CMP and the SCMP, but particularly on the SCMP, for people with more years of experience, you have a series of questions, and it's those questions are aligned with things that on a global standard, ISO standard, that you should have as a communication professional, whether you work in New Zealand or France or Dallas, Texas, USA. And there are things about you get questions about external comms and how you would deal with this. How would you build a strategic plan in these circumstances? What are the first things you would do? There's also questions about reputation and ethics compliance and other things that we believe globally that you need to understand as a well-rounded communication professional, even if you're not working in that space currently. So that's how the SCMP exam covers that. There, like I said, there's X percentage of questions that cover that when you take the exam.
Two-way communication is pretty easy to advocate for and hard to execute under pressure. What does good two-way communication look like when you can't answer every question and the situation keeps evolving and changing?
I think assessing your stakeholders' perceptions is the role of the communicator. In a crisis, communicators get often stuck or lost in the need to broadcast. But listening is just as important in order to position your message effectively with different stakeholders' perceptions, and recognizing who's on your side, who's against you, who's likely to actually take action against you, i.e., worst case scenario. If you do that work up front and then you again calibrate it during a crisis, you're more likely to communicate in a way that is going to be received by stakeholders, even if you can't answer every question that comes at you. So we tend to, because of crisis, tend to go into this broadcasting mode, which I think because of the pressure and speed, we got to say something, but actually there's not enough pause to say, okay, what are we going to say? And what do these people want to hear? What is their concern? So
yeah, and I would say it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
When you see something locally, there's been a fire, some people have passed on, whatever, something very serious, you will notice that well-trained people representing your local fire department or your police department or whatever that is, or maybe at the federal level, right? They're going to tell you what they know. They are telling you factually, this is what we know at this time. They will entertain questions, and then they say, I can't comment on that yet, or I don't know. But in an organization, what I recommend we do is say, I don't know, but we're going to try to get that answer for you and get back with you, whether we share it through some place where employee communicators can, or employees can see that, or the next time you're up in front of that saying, hey, we had a question yesterday about X, and I want to provide a response to that. I got some more information. But showing them that you sincerely care and you're going to try to answer that. Sometimes you have to come back and say, I don't have anything new, but I am continuing to investigate that. Just showing that you're sincere in trying to answer the questions that you can.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to get through all the questions that I have. We only have about 10 minutes left, 11 minutes. But I do have these questions at the end of my document that are labeled questions I shouldn't skip. So I'm going to skip to these. What's the single most dangerous myth about crisis communication that's still widely believed?
There's more than
That
one.
you can just wing it.
But yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, spinning the story. Yeah.
The CEO should always go up to the mic on every crisis and comment. I think that's problematic.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, George.
What's
also,
problematic about that?
You can turn a crisis into a positive by the way you handle it. If you really show your concern and your efforts to make right what broke, or what your disaster was, or whatever, the way you do that can actually reverse any negatives that people think about you and turn it into a big positive.
At my company, we have a formula, and we wrote a book, The Good, the Bad, and the Truly Ugly, for our 30th anniversary, which examines 30 years of crises and cases. And the formula is, what is your level of attribution of responsibility in the crisis? In other words, did you cause it? Did you partially cause it by negligence? Or are you a victim? Number one. And then multiplied by that, how did you handle it? And there are many examples of companies who were victims and messed it up completely, and the opposite as well. So I think what's important is owning up. And there's a lot of confusion between liability and responsibility. And owning up because the crisis is happening to you doesn't mean that you caused it. So establishing that ownership from the start actually stands by the values of the company, and recognizing that, I mean, there's some incredible examples of crises that were could have been completely avoided. They were completely created by the organization. And yet the ownership and the recognition saved the day, because there was humility in saying, okay, we really need to address this. This is not going to go away by itself. So we need to really take the bull by the horn and be transparent, and really, we're going to take a hit, because no crisis goes without some sort of loss. But by doing that, you actually can come out ahead, because you realize this is not a moment for spinning or trying to wing it, like you said.
Hey, Shell, if there's time, George said something that I was like, yes, yes, yes. George, can you expand on that? You said something about why the CEO may not be the right spokesperson, because I was nodding my head in agreement.
A lot of reasons. I mean, one is their ability, they're having the capability to do that just in terms of their temperament, experience, and training. But the other is, getting the CEO involved escalates it to sort of a company-wide issue. And so it could be an issue that, if it's an issue, say, in a local facility you have, let's say a manufacturing plant, that's probably something that can be handled at the plant level. And you got to be careful about, I think once you crank the CEO into it, you sort of, you're elevating it to, something that's really big issue for the company. And it may just be putting more emphasis on it than you need to.
Yeah, and if the CEO takes it on, he's got to remember that there's nobody to back him up, nobody beyond the CEO to take over. So I think it needs to be carefully thought through, that, for certain things at certain levels, it should be that person. And then, of course, the CEO at some point is going to come out if it's big enough, because if not, then it gives the impression that it's not important enough, and that's not good either. So it's a balancing. I don't think there's a one size fits all formula for that, but it has to be reflected upon. And there lies the job of the communicator to say, at this point, this is who should communicate. But if this is what happens, we're going to have to ask you, Mr. CEO or Mrs. CEO, to come out and address the situation.
What's the first thing you should do in the first 30 minutes of a crisis?
Own up. Own up that you have a problem. The crisis is here. If you come home and your house is on fire, you don't run.
Fault or not. You may not know. You have to get an idea of what's happening.
No, that's my point. If your house is on fire, you come home, your house is on fire, you don't run away to the neighbor, my house is on fire. You say, my house is on fire and I need to deal with it. I don't know if somebody caused it. I don't know if I had a gas leak. I don't know if there was a short in the fuses, but my house is on fire. I'm owning up that my house is on fire and I'm dealing with it. And too often leadership team thinks we need to figure out, is it our fault? Is it our problem before we say anything? And that's a mistake, because you've lost the opportunity to actually drive the information channel.
Yeah, one thing I have observed is that whoever communicates first establishes the message that all subsequent messages are trying to, shift or dislodge. And
Absolutely.
That's why you want to be first, even if all you're saying is, we know this is happening. That's all we know. And we're investigating, and we will communicate regularly as we learn things, and probably even just to let you know that we're still investigating.
In fact, there's a great standard. I mean, I started in my career unfortunately, with a major plane crash. That's how I ended up in crisis management. And the airline industry, which is obviously very, very regulated, by law, has to put out a holding statement, think holding pattern, a holding statement by law if one of its aircraft has disappeared from radar. And all they say is aircraft so-and-so from to, at this point in time, has disappeared. We're investigating. We'll come back with information. That's owning up. It's not somebody else's airlines. It's your airline. Maybe somebody shut it down. Maybe there was a problem with maintenance. We don't know, but they own up. And that's by law. Unfortunately, many other organizations don't have the same diligence, I would say.
Well, rule number one is to tell the truth. Don't lie,
Yeah.
and don't make up stuff to try to explain your way out if you don't know. Always tell the truth.
Anything else for that first 30 minutes?
Cancel your plans for the weekend.
Make sure,
I got a life.
yeah. Expect the ambush. Expect an ambush anywhere, anytime, any place. That's another one.
Have any of you observed a crisis that was handled better than most people realize?
I always use one example that I saw, I would say 15, maybe 20 years ago. Some of you, because it took place in the States, some of you may remember this. A British publication called The Observer called out the fact that baby Gap stores were made in sweatshops in India. And that went kind of pretty quick, even though at the time the social media was virtually negligible. And I remember that the CEO immediately got on top networks and say, this is absolutely unacceptable. I've just pulled a team together. I'm going to lead that team and go to India myself so we can inspect all the places where we manufacture our baby Gap clothes. So that we can come to the bottom of them, and if we find anything wrong, so we can fix it. In the meantime, if anybody has any doubts, you're welcome to come back to our stores and get an exchange or a refund. Nobody knows about this crisis.
Fascinating.
So, yeah. But you know how the news cycle is, and people are hungry for negative and dirty news and the stuff that, the laundry gets washed out. People don't have much appetite for crises that are well handled. Unfortunately, they tend to disappear. They just don't get the traction.
We have time for one more question. So let me go around and have each of you respond to this one. It's a good one for that call and response. If everybody who's watching this goes back to their organization tomorrow and does one thing to improve the organization's crisis readiness, what should it be? Robin, let's start with you.
I think the ongoing, what we've talked about just a little while ago in the conversation, which is it's not a one-time thing in the current geopolitical environment, in the current social media age, that you don't do media training once a year. You don't look at that one, you don't look at your playbook or your emergency process once a year. You look at it on an ongoing basis. And you also are paying attention to what's going on in the world, saying that could become something, not to deflect you from doing your day-to-day work, but making sure that you feel confident that you could respond to that reasonably and effectively should something happen. So I think it becomes something that is just part of how you do your job on a fairly regular basis versus, okay, we're going to rehearse this once a year sort of thing, that this is ongoing. You need to do this in order to be well prepared. Great.
George?
I would say go back and ask, do you know the true north for your organization? I mean, how does your organization add value to your customers, to employees, to the communities you serve? And do you live those values in a crisis? Because that's going to be the acid test. Whether you really walk the talk of your business. And that's where I think a lot of people's reputations get dinged in these crises when they say, well, look, you have this great positioning statement, this great statement for what your business is and the values you have, but you didn't seem to live up to them in this case. Can you explain? And so being prepared for that and thinking through the values that you need to highlight in a crisis are key.
Great. Ned?
I would pull the crisis communication plan off the shelf, go through it, see if it's a little out of date, send a memo up to the CEO and say, I've just reviewed our crisis communication plan. I think it's a little bit dated. I'm going to make some, bring my team together. We're going to make some recommendations and propose an update and then brief you on it. This is a way to get your foot in the door to tell the CEO that there is a crisis communications plan and that it was a team effort to put it together, keep it up to date, and they want the team wants the CEO to know what that plan is.
Great. Thank you. And Carolyn?
Well, crisis management is a very ungrateful field, because if you got it right and you do it right, nobody knows. So unfortunately, it's still too much treated as a cost, and it needs to be an investment. It's not something that 1 year you have in and 1 year you have out. It should be a permanent investment in the organization. And if it's embedded, it's a question of maintaining it and making sure it works. And so people have to stop treating it as a nice to have. They have to treat it as a must have. It's like a life jacket. You would never get on a boat or on a plane if you knew that there was no life jacket. At the same time, you got to make sure that life jacket works and that you know how it works and you know how to use it. It's the same metaphor here. And unfortunately, it's too often treated as, okay, if we get the money, we'll spend some money.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I do want to, before we go, let the listeners and viewers know about next month's Circle of Fellows, which I neglected to write down the day and time, but you can watch for the announcements. It's usually the third Thursday of the month, but there will be announcements pretty much everywhere. But we're doing something a little different. We're inviting somebody who isn't a fellow to Circle of Fellows, and that is Diane Chase, who is a former chair of IABC and a very experienced and professional communicator who's out with a new book called The 7 C's of Your New Communication Compass. Diane invited all fellows to write the chapters of this book. So we are going to do 2 episodes of Circle of Fellows in April and May with Diane and her co-authors. Next month's co-authors include Jane Mitchell, Ginger Homan, and Brad Whitworth. I'll be moderating, and I wrote one of those chapters as well. So it'll be interesting talking through what those 7 C's are with Diane engaged in that conversation with the fellows who wrote the chapters. So look forward to seeing everybody next month. To our panel, thank you very much. And that'll do it for this episode of Circle of Fellows.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all.